If the buyer fails to pay any one of the installment, the seller cannot take back the goods from the buyer. The legal ownership is also transferred. Whereas in hire purchase, it is not so. Legal ownership will be transferred after the last installment is paid. The possession of the goods passes from seller to the buyer. The buyer becomes the only owner after the last installment is paid, being the down payment received. Then, first year interest, interest suspense account debtor to interest account to be receivable. Hello, my dear students. I am Dr. B.S. Subramania, called by name Dr. B.S.S., Professor in Commerce and Management, Vidhyaashram First Aid College, a Temple of Excellence, MYSURU. In this session, I am going to hand Advanced Financial Accounting, second semester, Unit 2, Session 6 of BCom in favor of Accounting for Installment Purchase System. So far in the last session, we come across about hire purchase. Now today, the same chapter, we have got one heading chapter called Hire Purchase and Installment System. We solved some of the problems on hire purchase. Today, I'm going to solve on installment system. Before solving the installment system, I want to know that what is actually installment? What's the difference between installment and hire purchase? Then, what are the entries in the books of installment seller? What are the entries in the books of installment purchaser? Once you learn the format, we can go to form. Then, installment purchase system. It is similar to hire purchase, except for the transfer of ownership at the time of sale. I will explain this. An agreement takes place between the buyer and the seller to purchase the goods. The buyer makes the certain down payment at the time of signing the agreement. The balance is payable in agreed installment for certain period of time. The amount of installment and interest is payable are determined by signing the contract. In the installment system, the buyer will get the possession of the goods from the seller after signing the contract. The legal title of the goods is also transferred to the buyer. So, at the time of purchase, in the hire purchase system, the possession of the goods passes from seller to the buyer. The buyer becomes the only owner after the last installment is paid. But in installments, it is not so. At the time of agreement, he will pay the down payment. The balance will be paid in a number of installments as per the agreement. Along with the goods transfer, the legal ownership is also transferred from installment seller to installment purchaser. At the time of purchase itself, he becomes the owner of the goods. But it is not so in the case of hire purchase. In the hire purchase, only goods passes from seller to the buyer. The buyer becomes only the real owner. The legal ownership of the goods will be passed. Only last installment is paid. Whereas here it is not so. The goods passes at the time of the agreement. They will have an agreement between the seller and the buyer. He will put the signature. He will pay some down payment. The balance will be paid in the number of installment. Once he put the signing the contract, along with the good, the legal ownership is also transferred from seller to the buyer. This is the case of the installment system. Features. This is very important. Cash price paid in certain installment. Whatever the cash price paid, that has been paid in certain installment means it includes the cost price plus interest. Buyer gets possession and legal ownership. This is important. At the time of purchase itself, when you purchase the goods, the possession of the goods and the legal ownership transferred from seller to the buyer. If the buyer fails to pay any installment, the seller cannot take back the goods from the buyer. If the buyer fails to pay any one of the installment, the seller is not in the position to take back the goods. If the buyer fails to any installment, the seller can sue. This is the buyer for the balance due in the court of law. He can go against if the buyer fails to any one of the installment, the seller can go to court of law and sue the buyer. But he cannot take back the goods. But in the case of the hire purchase, he can take back the goods because the legal ownership lies with the seller. Buyer will pay more than the cash price of the asset, that the installment includes the cash. Buyer always pays more than the cash price, which is considered as an installment. Each installment includes the cash price plus interest. So very good features are there. Cash price paid in certain installment, whatever the cash price, that will once down payment, the balance will be paid in the number of installment. Buyer gets possession and the legal ownership at the time of purchase itself. If the buyer fails to pay any installment, seller cannot take back the goods. This is important. If the buyer fails to pay any one of the installment, the seller cannot take back the goods from the buyer. If the buyer fails to any installment, the seller can sue the buyer in the court of law. Buyer will pay more than the cash price, which is considered as an installment. So, generally we ask the differences between hire purchase and installment. We'll go one by one. First one, ownership the goods is transferred after the payment of last installment. So the ownership will not be transferred till the last installment is paid. That is in the case of hire purchase. Whereas in installment, ownership of the goods is transferred as soon as goods are delivered. At the time of goods delivered itself, along with the goods, the legal ownership is also transferred. Whereas in hire purchase, it is not so. Legal ownership will be transferred after the last installment is paid. Then, ownership remains with the hire seller. Only possession is transferred to the hire buyer. The legal ownership lies with the hire seller till the last installment is paid. Only goods pass from seller to the buyer. Here, both the possession and ownership are transferred to the installment buyer. At the time of down payment, along with the goods, the legal ownership is also transferred from installment seller to installment buyer. It is not so in the case of hire purchase system. Number 3, goods can be repossessed in case hire buyer breaches any condition in the agreement. If the hire purchaser fails to pay any agreement, the seller can take back the goods. Goods can be repossessed, taken back from the seller if the buyer fails to pay any one of the installment. Seller cannot repossess the goods. He cannot repossess the goods. Only he can file a suit. He cannot repossess, but he can file a suit to recover the balance. So he can go to a court of law and file a suit and recover the balance. Whereas here, he cannot do it because legal ownership is there. He can take back the goods. Here, he cannot take back the goods. Each installment is treated as hire for the goods. Goods become the property of the buyer only after the last installment is paid. The buyer becomes only owner after the last installment is paid. Here, buyer is the owner of the goods, therefore he will pay only agreed amount in installment. Here, at the time of purchase itself, the legal ownership will be transferred from seller to the buyer. The balance will be paid in the number of installments. Each installment is treated as hire charges, come payment of a part of the price. Each installment is total cash price plus interest. Each installment we are paying treated as hire charges, come payment of a part of the price. Each installment treated as a part of the price. Each installment is considered as a part of the price. It treated as a contract of transferring the goods on hire basis and later becomes a sale. It cannot become a sale at the time of agreement. It's only become the sale after the last installment is paid. It is considered a sale at the time of down payment is considered as a sale. Even though buyer is liable to make the payment of the balance too, because still the buyer is not paid the balance also, but still the buyer already becomes the owner at the time of the down payment. The agreement is taken place, the goods pass from seller to the buyer. At the time of the down payment itself, the ownership is also be transferred here. But in the case of hire purchase, it is not so. Only After the payment of every installment, he becomes the sale and he becomes the owner. Hire buyer is like a bailee, buyer is not a bailee. Hired seller is responsible for any repair of the asset. Here, hired seller is responsible for any repair of the asset. Here, seller is responsible. Here is buyer is responsible for any repair of the asset. Here, who is responsible? Seller is responsible. Here, buyer is responsible. Hope you understand these what's called differences. Then, what are the entries to be passed in the books of installment purchaser? On one, asset account data, interest suspense means total interest suspense account data to installment seller account, cash price of the asset, total interest, totally payable. Then we pay the down payment, installment seller account data to bank account, first year interest transfer, interest to interest suspense account, first year whatever the interest is there. Then installment seller account data to bank account, being first installment is paid, depreciation account data to asset account, transfer entry, profit and loss account data to interest account to depreciation account. I'll repeat once again. Asset account data, interest suspense account data to installment seller account, being asset and total interest. Installment seller account data to bank account, being the down payment. Then for interest account data to interest suspense account. Then installment seller account data to bank account, depreciation account data to asset account, transfer entry, profit and loss account data to interest account to depreciation account. So this goes to first year, second year start, interest account data to interest suspense account, installment seller account data to bank account, depreciation account data to asset account, transfer entry, profit and loss account data to interest account to division. This goes on like this, only amount changes. So you must be careful in asset account data, interest suspense account data to installment seller account, installment seller account data to bank account, interest account data to interest suspense account, then installment seller account data to bank account, depreciation account data to asset account, profit and loss account data to interest account to division account. Second year start, interest account data to interest suspense account, installment seller account data to bank account, depreciation account data to asset account, profit and loss account data to interest account to depreciation account. This goes on, only amount changes. Now, journal entry in the books of installment seller, there we go, only installment purchaser. Now, installment seller. Installment purchaser account data to sales account to interest suspense account, being asset sold and total interest. We receive the first installment, down payment. This is the down payment amount. This is the total amount to be received. This is a down payment amount, being bank account data to installment purchaser account, being the down payment received. Then first year interest suspense account data to interest account to be receivable. When receive the first installment, bank account data to installment purchase account, then it will be transferred to profit and loss account. Profit and loss account data to interest account. I will repeat. Installment purchaser account data to sales account to interest suspense account. Total amount payable by hire purchase, he becomes the debtor, he makes the sale, total interest is payable to hire seller. When a hire seller receives the first installment, bank account data to installment purchaser account, being the down payment received at the time of agreement. So first year interest transfer to from the interest suspense account, interest suspense account data to interest. Who has to receive the interest? The seller has to receive the interest. Interest the nominal account, debit the losses, credit the guy. Who has to pay that? It is under suspense account. Credited becomes the debit entry. Now, bank account data to installment purchaser account, being first year installment transfer entry, profit and loss account data to interest account. Now, you go to second year. Interest suspense account data to interest account. Secondary interest will be deducted. Total interest will be put in the interest suspense account. When you go with the secondary one by one, we are going to deduct from the interest suspense account. It should become zero. Total interest first year, second year, third year it will go. Then bank account data to installment purchaser account being second installment money received. Then profit and loss account data to interest account being interest transferred to profit and loss account. Hope you understand regarding this. This is very important. Ownership of the goods is transferred after the payment of last installment. Ownership of the goods is transferred as soon as goods are delivered. Important. Second one, ownership remains with the hire seller. Only the possession is transferred to hire buyer. Here, both the possession and ownership is transferred to the installment buyer. Goods can be repossessed in case of hire buyer breaches any condition in the agreement. Goods can be taken back. Hire seller, in case of hire buyer, breaches any condition. The hire seller can take back the goods. Seller cannot repossess the goods. Only he can file the suit to recover the balance. This is important. Then each installment treated as hire for the goods. The buyer is the owner of the goods at the time of down payment itself. Each installment treated as hire charges. Each installment treated as a part of the price. It treated as a contract of transferring the goods on hire basis. It is considered as a sale even though buyer is liable to make the payment. Hire buyer is like a bailee, buyer is not a bailee. Hire seller is responsible. Here buyer is responsible. Here seller is responsible. Here is buyer is responsible for the repair of the asset. This entry already assigned. Asset account data, interest expense account data to installment seller account, installment seller account data to bank account, interest account data to interest suspense account, installment seller account data to bank account being first installment paid, division account data to asset account, then transfer entry, profit and loss account data to interest account to division account. So second entry, interest account data to interest suspense account, installment seller account data to bank account, depreciation account data to asset account, transfer entry, profit and loss account data to interest account to division account. It goes on, only amount changes. So these are all entry in the books of hire purchaser. In the books of hire seller, installment purchaser account data to sales account to interest suspense account. When you receive the money, bank account data to installment purchaser account being the down payment received, interest suspense account data to interest account being first year interest, bank account data to installment purchaser account being first installment received, profit and loss account data to interest account being interest transfer. Second year, interest suspense account data to interest account, bank account data to installment purchaser account, profit and loss account data to interest account. Hope you understand. I have gone with the journal entry, difference between hire purchase and installment. I explained briefly about what is installment system, what is hire purchase system. I passed the journal entry in the books of the seller, in the books of the purchaser. In the next session, we solve the problem on installment system. Till then, goodbye. Meet in the next session with a problem.